The production possibility frontier or curve. It's a curve showing all the possible combinations of two goods that a country can produce within a specified time period with all its resources fully and efficiently employed. It shows the maximum potential output of the economy. The PPF can be drawn as a straight line, as I've shown in blue here, or as a curved line. Now, we will explain why it curves in a second. But the thing to note here is in our example, we got units of food in millions, and we got units of clothing in millions. We can see that it is possible to have the range of a combination of goods, and that combination is reflected along the red PPF curve. So for instance, at point X, we could have 4 million units of clothing and 6 million units of food. But at W, we would not be able to produce the combination of 5.5 million units of clothing and 6.5 million units of food. It would be unattainable. So we can only produce a maximum along the PPF curve. Okay, so on our PPF diagram, you can see that for to produce one extra unit of clothing before, we would have to have just given up 1 million units of food. So 1 million units of food was forfeited in order to get 1 million extra units of clothing. But when we moved from 5 to 6, so Y to Z, you can see that we now have to give up 2 million units of food just to get 1 million units of clothing. The reason being is that the factors of production are not transferable. So imagine somebody who was working in terms of producing food, a chef, is now making clothing. Well, they're obviously going to be a fairly inefficient producer of clothing, and therefore we are having to give up a lot more units of food as those productive chefs and so forth leave the food industry to work in clothing. So the key thing to understand here is the factors of production are not transferable. For that reason, we get an increased opportunity cost. So just look at that one more time. Here, I'll thicken that a bit so it's a bit clearer. You can see that's my opportunity cost to start with, quite shallow. But as I get to here, the line of best fit looks something like that. So as we get close to full output of clothing, our opportunity cost of giving up units of food greatly increases because the factors of production are not transferable. So on this diagram, it shows the growth in actual and potential output. So what you need to know, is that the shift from the blue to the red shows an increase in potential output. So imagine I had, here, X2. Now that's clearly unattainable, that combination of goods and services at the moment. However, over time, with successful supply-side policies that increase the quality and quantity of my factors of production, my PPF curve would shift outwards, and so it would become attainable. Okay, so potential growth is when the PPF curve shifts outwards. Imagine I'm here and my economy is highly inefficient. Well, I could have produced more food and more clothing, but still be inside the PPF. We would call this actual economic growth or short-run economic growth. So to reiterate, short-run economic growth or actual economic growth is inside the PPF. If it means the entire PPF curve is shifting to the right, that is long-run economic growth known as an increase in potential output. So on this diagram here, you can see my PPF curve in terms of the goods and services that could be produced. Well, clearly C is unattainable without any economic growth because I could not have that combination of goods produced. We can see that A and B is productively efficient. So you're going to note down that it's productively efficient if it is on the PPF curve. that means the factors of production are being used in the most efficient way, and therefore an efficient combination of goods is being produced between goods and services. D is inefficient, meaning one of the factors of production is not being used sufficiently. For example, there might be high levels of unemployment, so labour is not being used, or machinery is not being used. So in that case, it's inefficient because we are not using our full factor endowment. That is our combination of factors of production that our country has. Okay, so there's another example here. You could see from A to B would be our short-run economic growth, or our actual economic growth as we go from inefficient to efficient. But B to C would be long-run growth as our potential output increases. That is, the quality and the quantity of factors of production have increased. So you can see that there's lots of causes of long-run growth: discovering raw materials, increasing size of the workforce, increasing capital stock, increasing labour productivity because of better training and education, etc. But don't forget that the PPF can also shift inwards. And this we call negative economic growth, as opposed to when the PPF shifts to the right being positive economic growth. So negative economic growth, you can see the reasons here, such as natural disasters, war and conflict, etc. Okay, so this diagram here illustrates what happens when there's a pivot. So for instance, with consumer goods, we can see that they're unchanged, but the number of capital goods has increased. Therefore, we see that the PPF curve will increase, and the number of capital goods that we can produce increase, but the number of consumer goods remain unchanged. Now, this is quite a topical issue. Basically, it comes down to this. If a country increases the number of capital goods that it produces, as opposed to consumer goods, that could be a good thing, because capital goods, that's machinery, can be used to make other consumer goods, that's goods for consumers such as TVs and PlayStations, as well as extra machinery. The problem is, if we had focused on consumer goods are just that. They are for the consumer: a television, a laptop, or a console, games console. They cannot be used to produce other goods and services, albeit the laptop possibly could. Therefore, what you find is that countries like Japan, who focused on machinery, have found out that they could produce more goods and services. So unsurprisingly, over time, their PPF started to look a little bit like that. So not as many consumer goods, but over time, they had more capital and more consumer goods, because the consumer goods had made them so much more profit that their citizens had earned more income, and as they earned more income, they could demand more consumer goods. So therefore, the economy would produce more consumer goods. If Japan had not focused on that strategy and had demanded more consumer goods, well, they might have produced more consumer goods initially, gone to here, but that's it. Their economy would not have shifted beyond this point. It's only because they produced capital goods that it allowed PPF to shift further to the right. Reiterate, capital goods make consumer and capital goods. Consumer goods produce nothing than the satisfaction of a product in the short run.